1.4, Sustainability Part 5. Now, back to the idea of the environmental impact assessment. These environmental impact assessments incorporate a baseline study before a development project is undertaken. So what does the environment look like before any changes? They assess the environmental, social, and economic impacts of the project, predicting and evaluating possible impacts and suggesting mitigation strategies. So how can we make this less damaging? They are usually followed by an audit and continued monitoring. Each country or region has different guidelines for the use of environmental impact assessments. Now let's look at the first step. So what we can see here is the baseline study. What are the environmental impacts, the social impacts, the economic impacts? And in that case, we're going to measure. The next step will be to plan. In terms of planning, we're going to look at mitigation strategies, how to reduce the environmental impacts, the social impacts, the economic impacts. And once we've measured and planned, you can see we're going forward to act. There's going to be implement, put the strategies into action, follow the approved plan, continue measurement. And at that point, we may need to go back to the planning stage if the plans that we made based on the measurements we made and the predictions we made are not coming through. Now, the final step is to assess, monitoring and evaluation, assessing the impacts. What were impacts as predicted? Is it necessary to alter the project? So I jump forward a bit there by saying the act. So what we need to look at is there's the steps where we measure, first step, we plan, then we act, then we assess, then we may measure again, do more planning, act again. It can be a flowing cycle. And here's the overall the measure, plan, act, and assess. Next, we can take a look at the fact that environmental impact assessments provide decision makers with information in order to consider the environmental impact of a project. There is not necessarily a requirement to implement an EIA's proposals, and many socioeconomic factors may influence decisions made. In some countries, they're not taken, they're not followed, there's a variety of things going on. And here we can see that flow chart again that I described, where requirements and scope, that's the listen, the feasibility, consider, baseline climate risk if we're looking at a global impact, future climate, adaptations, appropriate communications when we're engaging people, and then finally the monitoring and review. And you can see here we're looking at the hazard, the risk, and the vulnerability of these various systems involved. Now, there are criticisms of the EIAs, that's an evaluation, include the lack of a standard practice, or the lack of training for the people carrying them out, or the lack of a clear definition of system boundaries and the lack of inclusion of indirect impacts. So there may be very clear the direct impacts, the indirect may not be quite as clear. And the framework at Wright that I'm going to show you in a moment is just one way to go about the environmental impact assessment process. There's no industry or governmental standard. And one of those reasons why there's no standard is because they're influenced by local and national government regulations and policies and interest groups. Here we go. Assessment framework. So you can start to see that we've got the projects and policy development, we've got the screening, the environmental impact development, the review, monitoring, and enforcement. And it's particularly at the enforcement level that things might not work as well. We've even seen that in the local Windsor, Nova Scotia area. But overall, you can see an image here of the assessment framework. Now, an ecological footprint is the area of land and water, more theoretical, required to sustainably provide all resources at the rate at which they're being consumed by a given population. If the environmental footprint is greater than the area available to the population, that's an indication of unsustainability. Now, you need to remember that there are global systems in play here, so it's not just what resources are in Nova Scotia or Windsor, but what resources are available globally to us. And remember, as you see the note here, the environmental footprint is not the area occupied by population, it's a measure of the theoretical amount of land needed to provide everything for that population, even things imported from elsewhere. So those strawberries or pineapples you've had, or the impact of the oil that was extracted somewhere else is measured in ecological footprint. Here's what it can look like. So here's an ecological footprint calculator that we can take a look at. What you do is you take the first step, and then it'll start asking you questions such as how often do you eat animal-based products, such as chicken, fish, eggs. It might be very often, which will increase the size of your footprint, or never, which reduces it. So if we went in the middle, and that's often a way to do an ecological footprint calculator here, just go in the middle and just see what your impacts are. Then you click to the next one, and it would be how much of the food that you eat is unprocessed, unpackaged, or locally grown. And if we're looking at where it's from, let's say food is from more than 320 kilometers away, it is processed and it is unpackaged, then things are better. Then we go forward here, which housing type best describes your home. And on this, you might decide to use your local boarding community or your home back home. Remember, if you own several homes, that does increase your footprint. So it could be freestanding, no running water, luxury condominium, multi-storied apartment. So those are some questions that you might find in an ecological footprint. Now back to the PowerPoint. So an ecological footprint is the area of land and water required to sustainably provide all resources at the rate at which they're being consumed by a given population. If the environmental footprint is greater than the area available to the population, that's an indication of unsustainability, and we can calculate the ecological footprint for individual countries as well as the human race as a whole. Now, questions you might be asked in terms of the environmental systems exam is to explain the relationship between natural capital, natural income, and sustainability. A graphic that kind of brings this all together is this one, where you can talk about natural income, sustainable annual yield, or taking more than the annual yield, which is unsustainable, and then that has impacts on the natural capital. Another question you might be asked is to discuss the value of ecological ecosystem services to society. And that would be this graphic. Maybe it's providing biodiversity to us, maybe it's providing provisioning such as wood, or maybe recreational areas. An additional question you might be asked is to discuss how environmental indicators such as the MA can be used to evaluate the progress of a project to increase sustainability. Additionally, you might be asked to evaluate the use of an environmental impact assessment, not just how to use it and why it's useful. And for that, you can take a look at the assessment of how they're determined, how they work, and how they're implemented. Finally, you might be asked to explain the relationship between ecological footprints and sustainability in terms of resource use, local and global resources. Thank you.